when we think about elasticity, this is another example of a thing that people have to be concerned about in business, because the fact of the matter is, depending on the type of product you're selling, elasticity isn't it's depends type of thing. Depending on the type of product you're selling, if you're selling, for example, I'll just specify two extremes of products, like a necessity, something that you absolutely positively must have, versus I'll call it a flavor of the month item that if you don't have it, you're not, big deal, right? The fact of the matter is that flavor of the month items are much more susceptible to price. The demand for it is much more susceptible to price, whereas necessities are not so susceptible to price, more specifically price changes. And this is what elasticity is really focusing on. It's saying to people in business to say, depending on the type of product, it's going to have an big impact if you were to change your prices. Because a lot of people will say, and we do it here, what if I charge a higher price? Can I increase my revenues by charging a higher price? You would think, well, price times quantity equals revenue, and if we could charge a higher price, we could make more money. Well, that's true only if the demand for it is what we call inelastic. And what that means in English is, let's assume we charge $1 for it. Now we're going to drive the price to $2. We'll double the price of it. Well, if it's an inelastic demand, that just means that the demand doesn't really change that much with price increases. Relative to the price increase, the demand doesn't change as much. And if we're into a situation where people buy just as much of it, regardless of $1 or $2, such as gasoline, right? Government know that if the price of gasoline goes up, you and I probably have the exact same car that we had last year. We probably drive the exact same number of kilometers that we did last year. So the fact that gasoline is 40% more now still means we probably just burn almost as much gasoline. Sure, yes, we have reduced, we're not out on a Sunday drive or these sorts of things. But the fact of the matter is that generally the amount of gasoline sold is about the same this year as it was last year, because the demand for it is inelastic, meaning people buy just as much of it anyway. And if you're in a situation like that, you're going to recommend to the government, yeah, drive up the price of gas, because the demand stays basically the same, let's say, for the sake of argument, and the revenue increases by 40%, so the price increases by 40%, so your revenue is going to increase by 40%. Wow, it's a no-brainer. Let's drive up the price. On the other hand, other products, such as marshmallows, okay? Marshmallows. Let's pick marshmallows. Let's assume that price of marshmallows, someone came up to you, you're selling marshmallows, and said, you could double the price of marshmallows and make a lot more money. And you think to yourself, well, can I really? Because what happens is, as you or I walk into the store to buy marshmallows, and if we know they were $1 last year and now they're $2, we're going to think twice. We're going to say, gee, they're very expensive. I could go and buy chocolate instead of marshmallows, or I could make my own marshmallows, or I could not buy it at all. I could buy something else. I could whatever. If effectively I have choices, I might say, no, I'm not going to bother to buy those overpriced marshmallows. And what's going to happen there is the price increased on the marshmallows, but the demand for it dropped a lot. So actually, the amount of revenue that the marshmallow company is making drops. And in this case, we are looking at a really what we call an elastic demand. By definition, this is an elastic demand because the demand for it drops a lot more than the price increased. Okay? It's going in the opposite direction. And as a result, companies that are selling elastic products that tend to be elastic, tend to be non-necessities, and they tend to be expensive. Trailers, travel trailers, toys, expensive toys, trikes, quads, these sorts of things. People would probably be much more sensitive to price increases on them than they would other items that are smaller and don't chew up so much of your income. So anyway, that's the kind of the big picture of what we're talking about with this elasticity. Now, we have been looking at taking the theory of elasticity and putting some numbers around it, okay? And when we look at the theory of elasticity, I'm just going to hop right through to the numbers we talked about. We came up with this calculation called the price elasticity of demand. What we're doing is we're calculating the amount of elasticity. In other words, we're really looking at the relative change in quantity purchased of a given item relative to the price change of that item. So we're asking ourselves, what percentage did the price increase? What percentage did the demand for it decrease? Okay, so we're kind of looking at saying, okay, if it went up by this much, what impact did it have on the demand? Did it drive it down by more, a greater percentage, the same percentage, or more? That's effectively what this little formula is doing. It's doing this assessment. The formula is pretty straightforward. The formula says, look at the change. All I need to do is look at the change in the quantity, the percent change in the quantity, and compare it with the percent change in price. That's exactly what the price elasticity demand does. It says, let's look at the percent change in the quantity and compare it with the price change in the percent change in price. And based on that comparison, we will know that one was greater than the other. Either the price change was a greater percentage or the quantity change was a greater percentage. If the price changes a lot, bigger percentage in price, and a little tiny change in quantity, then we have what's called an inelastic demand for the product. People buy just as much of it, or the price doesn't really phase them. Whereas if we got a relatively small price change, but a great change in the quantity, we say, oh yeah, people are very affected by the price. This is more of an elastic demand. So there's the formula. It looks pretty tame. And the moment that you think it's pretty tame, then you get into this thing here. Okay, so here's the basic formula that I had over here. But in order to figure out the percentage change, this is percent change in quantity demand. In order to figure out the percent change in quantity demand, what you got to do is you got to take the absolute change in quantity. So your quantity, for example, let's just use this example here. Your quantity went from 60 to 55. Okay, so that was a 5 change in quantity. And we take that and we divide it by the average quantity. So the average quantity then, well, we had 60 and 55. So the average is 57.5, halfway between those two numbers. So what we do is we take the actual change, 5, divide it by the average, 57.5, and that, when you multiply it by 100, gives you a percent. And all this means is, look, the price or the quantity changed by 8.7%. Okay? We have to do the same thing with the price. So we take a look at what is the actual change in the price. Well, in this case, the price went from 5 to 6. So the change in the price was $1. And then we divide that by the average price. So 5 to 6 is $5.50. So we take a $1 divided by 5.50. Do that for the purposes of the percentage, and it's 18.8%. Now, you know what? When we do this, I think that's far enough to go with it. They come out, they get this. This is called the coefficient of elasticity, this funny little e, and this 0.48. I just say, forget about that. Let's understand what this is really saying. Look, what this is really saying, look, the quantity changed by 8.7% because of the price change. The price changed 18%. And we ask ourselves, what went up more? What changed more? The price changed a lot relative to the quantity. And all that really tells you, when you read that, you think, okay, well, the price changed a lot, but the quantity didn't change as much. That, by definition, is inelastic. In other words, people bought almost as much. It was just the people purchasing habits didn't really change that much, despite the fact that the price changed. Over on this example here for product C, I did the exact same thing. We take the difference between the quantity divided by the average quantity, and that will give you 66.67%. So in other words, the quantity change between the first iteration and the second iteration was 67%. So we had a big change in the quantity demanded. And we look at, well, what happened to the price? Well, the price went from $5 to $6. The price just went 1 over 5.1. The price just changed 18%. So an 18% price change caused a 67% change in the quantity demanded. This is really saying, hey, man, the quantity dependent is really, really sensitive to a price change. Basically, the quantity was greater than the price change, okay? And this, by definition, is elastic. That's what that means. That means the demand for it is elastic. And again, you can get the coefficient of elasticity, and you will find that anything that's elastic gives you a number over 1. Anything that's inelastic gives you a number under 1. That's all that really the coefficient of elasticity is all about. As I mentioned the other day, we can see that we can graphically represent the elasticity, I suppose, in terms of the slope of the demand curve. So if we look at the slope of the demand curve here, okay, for product A is really saying, look, the price change was this much, and the quantity change was that much. And if you look, their price change and the quantity change are pretty close together in terms of actual size. So this is really what we define as an inelastic, that the steeper the slope, the more inelastic. This one over here has a very shallow slope because look, we have a price change of this much, but look how much it changes the quantity. So as the slope gets less steep, shallower, it would indicate more of an elastic demand. Okay, so that's a basic review of what we looked at so far. Any questions? Here's a nice little summary that's in the book, Table 4.4, and the summary really gives you a kind of this is I'll call it a quick guide to, if someone asks you, if a business person would ask you, should I raise my prices? Should I raise prices? Well, it really depends on how elastic the demand is for the product you're selling. If, for example, the demand for the product is inelastic, all that means is, look, you're going to sell just as much regardless of what the price is. Okay? If the price rises, total revenue rises. You tell that to the government of Newfoundland with regards to taxing gasoline or taxing booze or taxing cigarettes. Okay? These things tend to have, if the price goes up, it has very little impact on the amount of products sold. As a result, total revenue goes up. No wonder governments always tax those things, right? Because they're very inelastic demand for them. And the same would hold if the price would fall. If the price would fall, the total revenue will fall. So they're correlated. In other words, a fall, a fall. They're positively correlated. In terms of elastic products, and what we mean by elastic products is that if the price goes up, the demand for them just starts to fall quickly. If we got a fairly elastic price, if we rise the price, the total revenue is going to fall. So if you're selling elastic demand products, meaning stuff that people don't really need or there's lots of substitutes for, rising the price could work against you in terms of your total revenue. And so you notice that there's an inverse relationship. So the rising price causes a fall in revenue, as would happen if you had a falling price, it would cause a rising revenue. This is just representing the opposite scenario. And then we got this funny scenario, which is a theoretical only, called unitary elasticity. And unitary elasticity just means that the percentage of the rise in price matches the percentage of the change in revenue. So it's a one-to-one, same relationship. Now, okay, so I've talked a lot about this mechanics now, and we ought to ask yourself, well, in the real world, what causes things to have an elastic demand? Why would certain items be more elastic in terms of demand? And just what that means in English is, look, if we adjust the price of it, it's going to have a big impact on the quantity sold, okay? So if we adjust the price up, the quantity sold is going to drop like a stone. Or we drop the price down, quantity sold is going to go up like a rock, up like an airplane, let's call it. So what are some of the things? Well, the first thing is substitutes. If there are no substitutes, you have to have a heart drug, and that's the only heart drug that exists, you're going to pay whatever you can for that heart drug if you need it to survive. Okay? There are no substitutes. However, as you bring substitutes onto the market, if you've got lots of choices for heart drugs, there's 16 different types of heart drugs, you're going to shop around and find the one that's the lowest price to do what it needs to do for you. So more substitutes means that people become more price sensitive to a given item. In other words, I don't need to buy Coke because I can switch to Pepsi, or I don't need to try heart drug A because I can switch to heart drug B. It'll do the same thing for me. So substitutes make a difference. And this is why a competitive environment, such as what we live in here, is better. And a more competitive environment is better again, because we're not so sensitive to price changes of given items because we've got lots of choice. The other thing that's very important is the percentage of household income that's spent on a commodity. Listen, if you're fantastically rich and you have a household income of $6 million, $10 million a year, do you really think that you're going to be too concerned about the price of gas? Probably not. However, if you're a minimum wage person and you have to get your car filled up every single week and it takes every ounce of energy and money out of you in order to do that, you're going to be very sensitive to price changes. So household income, depending on what you buy, you know, if like, for example, yesterday I bought some Skittles. I really like Skittles. I didn't really look at the price of them, because how many do I buy? If I buy 2 bags a year, that's it. Does it matter to me? No. If it was, I think it was $2 for the bag, I said that's reasonable. If it went to $3, I'd probably still buy as many bags, but I'm only buying 2 bags anyway. And realistically, you know, I probably got a toonie kicking around in the car somewhere that I could use to buy it. The other thing that fits us, and this is where psychology comes into, is the amount of time that's elapsed since the price increase. We always find, if you go up around the gas station, Co-op gas bar or any of the gas bars in town on Wednesday evenings, when you know the price of gas is going to go up, wow, there's a big line up there, people filling up their cars, right? Well, that's because they heard on the radio or they saw on Facebook the price of gas is going up next morning. So, you know, they're up to the gas station lined up like crazy. But what's going to happen is, as time goes by, even though they were so motivated to go up and buy gas that night, as time goes by, they probably won't be as motivated to go up and buy cheaper. That, you know, they're going to forget next week what the price of gas was last week. And as a result, people say, oh, I'm used to a higher price of gas now, as we are. You know, someone had put up there yesterday, the price of gas was 40 cents lower last year this time than it was now. Realistically, I didn't remember what the gas price was last year. So time heals, I suppose, in terms of the demand issue as well. This has a more practical perspective, this one here, which is really the theoretical range of elasticities, okay? Here's one theoretical extreme, here's another theoretical extreme. The theoretical extreme in the first case is, look, for a given change in price, so here's the price line here. So let's say the price was down here and then it went up to here. You know, if demand stays exactly the same, the quantity being sold is identical, regardless of the price, that's by definition perfectly inelastic, right? No demand change, no matter what the price is. On the opposite extreme, we have a more realistic but still probably idealistic perspective, where we have perfectly elastic. So, you know, given any price, the demand is all over the map. Really, you know, the coefficient is infinity. The reality is somewhere between those two. And here we have this unitary elasticity, where we get a one-to-one relationship. For every little bit percentage change in price, we have the equivalent percentage change in the demand. What I wanted to look at today, just to finish off these couple of things, is the more practical end. And, you know, here, for example, you see this in the news. Now, this is, the government hadn't delivered the budget yet, but here's the budget last year. And Siobhan Cody got up and said, the government will not dip much more into your wallet except for small increases in some so-called sin or transportation taxes. There will be a 20% tax brought in on vaping products. Tobacco taxes are also going up 5 cents per cigarette and an additional 10 cents per gram on fine cut tobacco. And we have to ask ourselves, why did the government do that? They're saying we're not going to dip into your wallet that much, but we're going to go after cigarettes. Well, they recognize that the demand for cigarettes doesn't really change. And, government's going to spout that, it wants to get people to stop smoking and this sorts of things. Nothing could be further from the truth when it comes to taxation. Health policy, yes. But in terms of taxation, they know that cigarettes, people will tend to smoke just as many cigarettes regardless of what the price is. So government go after those products and tax to death out of them because they know that that price increase caused by taxes will not change the amount, will not realistically change. There will be some change, but not too much. Will not realistically change people's demand for that product. Booze and cigarettes and now marijuana are what are considered highly taxed products because government loves the fact that people buy just as much of it. And we call this sin taxes. That's the term that's used in the political realm, where we can tax things that people are going to buy that's probably not good for them, but they're going to do it anyway. So this is why, you ask the Trudeau Liberals there a few years ago, legalized marijuana. Well, of course they did. Was it public policy? No, they looked at it and they probably said, look at the taxation money that we're losing here in the black market for weed. So now when you buy weed legally, you pay tax on it. But that tax goes into the government coffers. They saw an opportunity to tax things. And booze, back in the day of Prohibition, when booze wasn't allowed, government realized that, hey, you can tax this stuff, and suddenly booze became allowed too. So it's a standard type thing. I don't think they've figured out a way to tax Facebook yet. They should probably do that. And you can see the impact of these tax increases, because what happens is demand for any of these products that you put sin tax on is relatively inelastic. In other words, a nice steep sloped curve, right? And when they put tax on it, drives up price. You can see that the price goes up, let's say this much. I'm going to call that on my computer screen. On my computer screen, that's 3/4 of an inch. I don't know about your computer screen, but anyway, it goes up that much. But look how much the quantity changed. Well, the quantity only changed by less than 1/4 of an inch. So realistically, you've driven up the price. It hasn't really affected quantity nearly as much. So that just means that your revenues are going to go up, and this is why it is such a wonderful item to tax. If they tried applying sin taxes or these types of taxes to products that had a very shallow demand curve, the demand for it would be greatly affected, and the amount of revenue that would be increased wouldn't be that much because people would say, no, I'm not going to bother to buy it. A lot of governments have, as I say, from a taxation point of view, they love drugs because they tax drugs, marijuana, for example, but a lot of drugs are illegal. So let's think cocaine, for example. And, back when I was in university, the George Bush Sr. at the time said, we're going to have a war on drugs. And what did he mean by that? Well, what he wanted to do was actually declare a war on all the drug lords and get drugs off the streets by going after the drug lords, get drugs off the streets, and suddenly the world would be a better place. Okay? Very ideal. It sells well very politically. We're going to get the bad people and put them in jail was the simple, and that sells well to voters. Okay, so let's do that. Let's take all of the drugs off the street. Okay, so we've got all the bad people put in jail, and the world's problems are solved, right? No, they're not. Because we have to remember that drugs are addictive. So just think of all the people out there who have been addicted to drugs now, and the supply of drugs to them have dropped phenomenally because all the bad people are in jail after all. So what do? They suddenly the price of the drug that they are dependent on, and some of those drugs, they are physically dependent on the drug. Tobacco is a classic example. You're physically dependent on it. You've taken that away from people, and they can't afford to buy it anymore because the price of it has gone up because the supply has been cut. So what are those people going to do? They got to buy the drugs. So where are they going to get the money to buy the drugs that are harder to come by? Well, generally what they're going to do is steal it. So what we saw after George Bush, the senior, put all the bad people in jail is that there were a whole much more bad people created who were stealing from people. People's homes were getting broken into. People's cars were getting stolen. There was a black market for this, that, and everything else for sale. The reason was because the drug addicts had to fund their addiction, and they did that by stealing. So the people that, if we ask what was the net effect, there was still a lot of crime. There was a tremendous amount of crime created because the drug lords went in jail. So you solved one problem, but created a totally new one. So the war on drugs generally has caused as much problem as it has solved. And this is why over the last number of years, despite the fact that Donald Trump was in office, a lot more effort has been put into socially progressive methods of dealing with drug addiction, for example, counseling. Okay, so we need to put those supports in place before we put all the bad people in jail. The other thing that comes into play here is this issue of farmers or fishermen. It doesn't matter. Farmers or fishermen, they have a really good year sometimes. The summer's good for them, the sun shines, the rain falls, their crops come up, and they're all so happy. But are they? Because what happens when a farmer has a really good harvest or a fisherman has a really good fishery is the prices for the products they just harvested drop because realistic supply is overwhelming. In the case of Newfoundland, for example, when there's too many fish collected, the fish plants can't deal with it, the price of the fish drops, and the fishermen suddenly become upset. So, they had a really good year. There's lots of fish out there, but they can't sell them for any money. And this is a typical problem that happens because of supply and demand. We see that a good harvest creates lots and lots and lots and lots of supply. But because the demand for these products tends to be pretty standard, I'm eating as much bread or I'm eating as much fish as I ever did, so I'm not going to suddenly increase my habits by eating more of the products that they're suddenly producing more of. So you get a glut, and this drives down prices. And even though the farmers are happy to sell a lot more product, they're getting a lot more money, a lot less money for it. And because of the elasticity of the demand for the product, they're probably making less money this year, even though they've had a good crop. And this is a bit of a problem. So the elasticity demand for more basic commodities such as wheat and rice is more flexible, basically, because there's lots of substitutes. So if we combine an inelastic demand, meaning I'm going to eat as much fish as I ever did, with the fact that a good harvest will increase the supply and shift the supply curve to the right, this effectively decreases the price or decreases the revenue for farmers. So farmers are not happy, and fishermen probably are not going to be happy in any case. So too much of a good thing is not good. So we see the effect of that effectively in the graphic right here, where you can see the supply shift and actually the price. This was the price, and when the supply line shifts, it effectively brings the equilibrium price down, and farmers make less money.